All right, so welcome to our free prep hour on the science of reading comprehension. Um, Feel free to check out any of our class offerings coming up. So I basically want to talk about the science of reading comprehension, or I could have said the reading comprehension of science, basically because a lot of people tell me, hey, I like reading comp, it's cool, I know how to read, I'm a bookish person, that's why I want to go to law school in the first place, but these science passages are killing me. They start talking about enzymes and isotopes and diffraction and scattering of radiation and all these things, and it loses me. Either I don't care, or I want to care and I don't get it, or I get it but it takes too long, or I feel like I get it and then the questions are really difficult and complicated and I get down to two and I can't pick the one. And so I'm going to try to help with as much of that as I can in the short time we have together today. There's no short answer. Sometimes people tell me, hey, the passages are really hard, and I say, yeah. So get better at them. It's tough. It's like if I said, hey, I'm having trouble finishing a marathon, and well, run more and train. That is partly an honest answer, but there are some very specific things we can do to get more comfortable with these. And I think one of them is very similar to how we get better at games. Does anyone ever feel when you're doing a logic game that there's something you're supposed to be in on that you're missing? Like, there's some inference you're supposed to make or something you're supposed to have figured out and you haven't figured out, and it's going to show, and you're going to bomb all the questions and everyone's going to laugh at you. Have you ever had, maybe I'm giving you a nightmare you don't need to have, right? I've had it, even as a teacher. So has anyone had that experience? You're doing a logic game and you just feel like you haven't got what you need. This is an experience. Okay, I'm seeing some yep, yeah, right. And sometimes it's true, unfortunately. Sometimes we look back and go, oh, I totally misunderstood the game. I thought there could be two people per session and there could really only be one, and I misread that, and oh, now it makes so much more sense, right? Or, oh, I needed to infer that L could only be first, and once I knew L could only be first, then everything will fall into place, right? But there are other cases where there's no such thing. There's no missing magic piece that you were missing. It's just a game where you have to sit and figure stuff out. And the way I connect that to reading comp is a lot of times people feel like, oh, someone else who's smarter than me totally gets this passage, totally knows all this stuff about, barium and deuterium decomposition and whatever, the age of the universe or whatever it is, right? And I don't get it. And at some point, it might be helpful to realize, like, you're not really supposed to know it that well. You're not supposed to know the stuff in advance. Knowing some basic science, I'm sure, is helpful, right? It's nice if you know what a neurotransmitter is, if you know what an ion is or something like that. I'm sure that can ease the process. Extreme case, if there's vocab that's like standard but that you personally don't know, that can be tough. And some of my second language students feel very frustrated by the harder reading comp because it goes beyond conversational English. It's the kind of thing that people don't talk about. And if you haven't done this kind of study in English, you might not have come across these words in English, and that can make it very hard. However, it's very useful to realize, like, hey, I'm not supposed to be an expert on this, right? I'll tell you, last time I took the LSAT, I saw a passage. It was almost like a joke. And I almost felt like I was cheating because I got a passage that might as well have been written for me. And what I mean by that, it was about a topic that I knew very dearly. My dad is a professor who taught one of the books they were referencing. I was very interested in this book and had read it myself and knew something about the kind of points they were making in the passage. This was great for me, right? Then I see another passage that was all about physics. And I go, oh, my friend, the physicist who's taking this test, is going to love this one, right? But the fact is that we both did well on both of them, not just because we're both clever, but because we have a process, right? And if you have a process, it doesn't matter that much what it's about, right? It doesn't have to be your favorite. You can still get it. And so I think we want to make sure we have the good process and we're not letting the science terminology or the law terminology or whatever it is intimidate us. It's funny when people are struggling with law, of course, because you go, wait, you're going to go to law school, right? But you're not supposed to be an expert on law going in. So some of the law passages get very technical and weird. And again, you're not supposed to be already an authority on these things going into law school. So it's a matter of getting past some of those complexities. So what I do, a couple things. I want to start with a drill from the 5-Pound book. If you aren't familiar with the 5-Pound book, this is a book we made of extra practice problems, which might seem silly since there are thousands of real LSAT problems available to practice from, but these are really designed to practice very specific skills. And so what this drill is doing is asking you to answer some specific questions in response to a passage map. So let me show you what we're talking about. Okay, so let me put this up here. So one of our goals when we're reading is to read for what we call the scale, which is like what's the basic idea, dilemma, disagreement, or whatever of the passage. And in a science passage, that's often, hey, there was a new theory and now there's there was an old theory and now there's a new theory, or here's a phenomenon we don't understand it yet, so what's the explanation, right? This or that. Often it's a sort of a binary thing, but it's not always. Sometimes it's about a process. We tried this, we tried this, we tried this, we finally found something that worked. But we also want to have a passage map, which basically tells us what is each part of the paragraph, each part of the passage doing, and how does that serve the overall? So an example would be something like this. This is an exercise for a book. The instructions, for those who are curious, are at the top. But basically, we just have a very rough map of a science passage. Paragraph 1 says, scientists couldn't explain the crystals found in tree sap. Paragraph 2 says, broader discussion about how the crystals usually form in nature. So they're getting into what we usually see about these crystals. Paragraph 3 is describing some kind of North Pole equator tree sap experiment. This sounds very interesting. Maybe they, either they were growing trees near the North Pole and growing trees near the equator, or maybe they were taking the sap itself. I don't know. Obviously, if I'd read it, I would know. But the point is, there's some kind of experiment done, and we don't necessarily have to know all about it. And then the author tentatively endorses the barometric pressure explanation, whatever that is. So notice that right now, there's a lot of questions you probably have and a lot of things you don't know. But what's important to recognize is that I may not need to know those things to answer certain questions. And so, one thing we want to be able to do is salvage a passage that doesn't feel great, where we say, hey, I don't feel like I understand everything they're talking about, and I can't fix that necessarily, but I can know enough to get to the overall point. It's like a really involved movie where you don't really understand why, that code got put onto that computer and why it's now, stowed in the bottom of a submarine at the base of the, whatever. But you can still say, all right, but the bad guys have it, right? And the good guys are going to go punch the bad guys. Okay, got it. I know that much, right? And so sometimes, not to dumb it down, but just to simplify a little bit and say, okay, there's a thing that the good guys want and the bad guys have it and the good guys are going to go get it, right? We can do the same thing with a science passage. I don't necessarily understand that much about the crystal instructor or why it's enigmatic or what exactly the experiment was or what maybe barometric pressure is. Imagine you didn't know the word barometric, right? Or pressure for that matter. You could be, it's the blah, blah explanation. Okay, but I still know there was a mystery. We see this certain thing happening. We did an experiment, and the author, based on the experiment, now thinks that one explanation makes sense. And that's the main thing I need to have. Anything else more detailed, I'll go back and try to find it in the passage. But to answer a bigger picture question, I can do it right now. So I'm going to give you a question. And it's going to be a broad question, primary purpose. Why did the author write this passage? So not having read this passage, the passage actually doesn't exist, as far as I know, just go in and chat into me your favorite answer. Which of these makes most sense? Okay, seeing a few answers. Go ahead and give it a shot if you're not sure. Give us your best guess at an answer. Obviously, in real life, you'd have read the whole thing, but we're playing the odds here. To help you out, I only gave you 3 choices. So if you're here, give me an answer, even if you feel unsure about that answer. All right. Well, the folks who answered gave me A. Okay. So let's talk about the others. No one chose C. Why not? What's wrong with C? Because they certainly talked about an experiment. There was a tree sap experiment. It seems pretty important. Why can't I say their purpose was to summarize research findings? Interesting. So is it multiple or singular? Findings is tricky because I could have one study with multiple findings, right? For instance, maybe I looked at, the effect of early childhood discipline measures on, on people's later behavior or something like that. And I found multiple findings. People who are treated this way were more this. However, parents who this were more likely to experience that as a child, or blah, blah, blah. Maybe I found several things. So it's possible that it's plural. Is there any other reason that you might want to get rid of C? Oh, yeah. So the author is pushing a perspective, and it seems important for the author, if we're trying to find their primary purpose, to include the author's opinion. Generally, if I have a main point or primary purpose question, and I leave out the author's opinion, or at least leave out the presence of an opinion, I'm probably wrong. Now, certainly there can be a difference between primary purpose and main point. Uh, uh, the kind of answer C. So, for instance, my primary purpose might be candidates for president, and my main point might be candidate X is the best one, right? So the first one is just what I'm trying to do, and the second one is what my actual opinion is. But even in the primary purpose one, I'm evaluating. I'm trying to express an opinion. I just haven't told you what my opinion is yet. Right. So yes, summarize doesn't seem enough. And another important thing is that there's the only place where they talk about research findings that I can see is paragraph 3. Again, I don't have the passage in front of me, but it seems like only paragraph 3 is mentioning research findings, and so it seems a little too narrow in scope. And then, as Talia is saying, it also feels a little neutral. Now, B is definitely not neutral. B says demonstrate the futility of a certain methodology. What are the chances of that being right on an LSAT question? I would argue vanishingly small. When you see a word like futility, certainty, basically when they're saying this is dumb and ridiculous, none of that, that's probably not the answer, because that implies a degree of certainty that, notice we have the author tentatively endorsing something, and this time saying, no, that's it, you just never want to do this. They could have said that. That's possible. I don't know. But it's very, very unlikely. So we want to be very careful about extreme answer choices. But notice this is also narrow. It's only talking about methodology. It's not giving me anything about tree sap. And so although A doesn't say the word experiment or findings or tree sap or anything like that, what it does, it says, hey, there's a hypothesis. I'm guessing the hypothesis is this barometric pressure explanation. And they've shown it to us, and they're helping us to understand if it's right. That fits the overall, because, hey, we were trying to figure out, right, since the question, this is a passage about why. Right? The passage is about why. Well, we can say, oh, well, then, we can then say, why is a hypothesis. Why did this thing happen? Why is the author doing this thing? Why is this tree sap forming, right? And we want something that addresses that. Right? The passages are often fairly tightly focused like this, right? Some people overdo this when they're analyzing, say, like movies or stories, right? I read a book about storytelling that basically said that the movie Die Hard is really just about Bruce Willis's character's relationship with his wife. And that's what it's all really about. It's not really about fighting the bad guys. I'm like, it seems like he spends a lot of time like shooting people and stuff, right? That's all just about his marriage. There's nothing else. So that was a little oversimplified. Maybe that was what the author of that take found most important or interesting in the story. But I'm not sure you could argue that that is the facts. Like, it is simply it's a love story, man, right? That's why everyone watches it at Christmas. But on the LSAT, typically there is like a focus, like, okay, the passage is why something is happening, or the passage is trying to uh, choose between two options, or suggest that a certain way of doing things is outdated, right? And so we want to see what kind, is it a why, is it a how, is it a which one, like what kind of determination are they making in the passage, and run with that. Okay. So then we can have a more general, or sorry, a more specific, I guess you could say, main point question, where they're actually asking what point does the author want to make. But we can think in the same way. The right answer shouldn't just be one little tiny thing that we'd see in one line or one paragraph. It should be something that ties together. We couldn't figure out why these crystals are forming. Here's what they do. Here's this experiment we did. And here's now kind of what we think might be what's happening. So again, pick an answer and be bold. Put one in even if you're not sure. Take a moment to do this. I'll check in with you in about 30 seconds, but give your best shot out of these three. Oh, sorry, I didn't uncover the whole question. Silly white boxes. That's better. If anyone thought that didn't look like a proper sentence, that's why. All right, let's have those answers. Even if you're not sure, give us a guess. I want to encourage everyone to guess, because one other really important thing about this test is at some point we just got to move on. We got to get out of there. And so we don't want to spend too long on any one question. It's not worth it. I got 6 of you. I'd like to see 6 guesses if you can, even if you feel like, I don't know. It's good intellectual habit to get into. Okay. All right, so I got a variety of answers on this one. Do you guys find this one harder than the last one? One thing we want to watch out again for is anything that's too narrow. Now, these are all fairly specific, right? A is talking about hexagonal crystals, and B is talking about experiments in extreme environments, and 1 is talking about formation of crystals in nature. So that's all fairly specific. And these are, unlike the last one, they're not vague, they're content specific. But we then want to say, okay, we know this passage, whatever it was, I haven't read it, right? But whatever this passage was, it's talking about why these crystals form in this tree sap. Where do these crystals come from? And so their point was, hey, I think I might know why these crystals are forming. So when I see something like C that says, hey, the formation of crystals is a function of something, hey, that's promising. And then I see the crystals within tree sap maybe influence, hey, that's promising. Notice what B is missing that's really important. There's nothing about trees. There's nothing about sap. There's nothing about crystals. That can't be the main point, right? If I'm giving a speech of why you should, vote for me for mayor, and then someone says the main point is about the corruption in City Hall or something like that. Maybe I went on and on about the corruption in City Hall, but if I didn't get around to vote for me for mayor, or if you didn't know that's what I wanted from you, then I failed in my speech, right? Or you weren't listening. So we want to make sure that we're catching that, right? So there's got to be, this is missing tree sap and the crystals. It's got to have that. They may think this. They may believe this is true, right? Just like, I don't know, let's say I'm running for mayor and I'm saying, I'm younger and have, fresher ideas, so vote for me. I may believe that the youngest, freshest candidates are going to be the most qualified for office. Maybe I believe that. but is that the actual point I made? No, I was just saying about me. My point was about me. I don't care about anyone else, right? Selfish that way. So now I look at A and C. They both talk about the reason for crystals. Now, since I don't really understand the science that well, even if I'd read it, I might not. I could see, hey, they both mention pressure. I could be understandably down to these two. And you know, I already simulated this partly by getting rid of two for you. I just gave you three choices. So someone might be stuck on A versus C. And it is absolutely fine to just pick one and move on. That's fine. And sometimes we have to do that. And we'll come back to it if we have time. When you're reviewing, when you're not taking the real test, that often involves saying, okay, let me look back and justify the distinction. But there has to be one. It can't just be, well, whatever they think. And another reason I call this session the science of reading comprehension is that we don't want to treat it like something arbitrary. Well, we just like this one better. Instead, it has to be, there's a reason that this is really different. So if I summed up this point as the author is trying to explain why crystals form in tree sap, I'm going to get rid of C. Can you see if I just simply summarize that, right? So specifically, I'll say passage about why what? Why crystals form in tree sap, or maybe why these particular crystals form in tree sap, whatever. What is missing from C that's really important? So there's a certainty in C that we don't like, is primarily. So this is extreme, it's certain. Yeah, another really important thing it's missing is the tree sap, right? So it's also missing the sap. So it's too general. And what you'll often find, it's a really actual common problem, is that something is both too general and too specific at the same time, right? Imagine that I went to the movies with my wife and I got some popcorn and I salted it like crazy. And later on, she got really mad at me. She said, you know, you never respect me. You don't ever do things the way I like. You like your popcorn really salty, and you should know that I don't. And, you know, and she starts going off on other examples about how I'm just mean and I don't, you know, think about her feelings and all that. And at the end, I say, so you're saying that women don't like salty popcorn? And she'd be like, no, right? No, first off, the popcorn isn't the point, right? It was just an example, right? And the other is that it wasn't about all women. It was just about this one, right? And so on the one hand, I was overgeneralizing. All women don't like salty popcorn. Who knows that? But on the other hand, I was getting too narrow. The point wasn't just that one thing. And so you'll see that a lot with answers that have scope problems, that they're both too narrow and too broad at the same time. Whereas A is not super obvious. It's not like we look at A and go, well, of course that's what they said. I didn't see anything in my passage map that said they were hexagonal. And partly what I'm trying to simulate here by not giving all the information is that you might not always know what those things are. You probably know what hexagonal means, but there will be some other vocabulary word that you won't know, or you won't recognize, or you won't remember seeing in the passage. It doesn't matter. If A is right, the others are wrong. Similarly, you may very well know that barometric pressure and atmospheric pressure are good matches for each other. You may know that, you may not. But in the end, it doesn't matter if we know that A is the only one that talks about why tree sap in particular forms crystals, then it's the only one that works. So that's a really important thing to do. And you might say, well, it's all very nice if someone hands me a passage map, but you can make these passage maps. And you can make these passage maps even when you don't feel good about the science and you don't feel good about the content. So I want to try that, but and I'm gonna make sure you don't feel too good by giving you an impediment. But I'm curious if you have any questions before we move on from this one about anything we talked about here. Okay. Well, in that case, I'm going to clear this out. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a passage. This is from Prep Test 68, if you want to look it up later. And I'm going to erase most of the passage. And I'm going to do something that I've done sometimes for students who really didn't like reading comp, right? For instance, I've had students who were not fully fluent in English and really felt just overwhelmed by having to do this much in a short amount of time. and they really benefited from just reading less. It sounds funny, but sometimes we just have to read less. So what I'm going to do, and you can actually do this, at least in practice. You may, by test day, you might not do it, but I'm not saying it's impossible to do on test day. I'm just going to have you read the first sentence of every paragraph. It's not a magic technique. It's not going to make you understand things that aren't there, but it's going to give you a broad sense of the scope of the passage, and you're going to have to infer some things because they're going to talk about stuff that you won't have read about yet. Until they bring it up in maybe for a second or third time in the beginning of a paragraph. So take a moment to read these openers of the 3 paragraphs of the passage, and we'll come back and discuss. So another nice planty passage, right? You might have wanted one about quantum physics or something if that's what really drives you crazy. But again, most of us aren't botanists. We don't have an expertise in the chemical compositions of plants and things like that. And although this one isn't the worst one I've seen in terms of vocabulary, conceptual nature, we're now making it pretty bad by taking away most of this stuff. But sometimes taking away is really helpful. I've seen students who can practically recite verbatim to me a lot of the facts from the passage. They've read it so carefully and so well in a short time. It's very impressive. But then when I ask them the overall point, they don't get it. And you don't want to miss the forest for the trees. So we want to make sure we have a general sense of what this passage is trying to do. So when I look at the first sentence, that doesn't tell me that much. It says the characteristic taste of a plant depends on its chemical composition. Well, that doesn't seem like news. Everything in a plant would depend on the chemicals it's made of, so that's not that exciting an opener. But it started to talk to me, at least it gives me a sense of what the topic's gonna be, chemicals in plants. Now, when I jump to the second paragraph, I've skipped over all this important stuff, and we'll come back and read that, obviously. But I've skipped over a lot of important stuff. So now I go to paragraph 2, and it says, insects appear to have played a major role in many plants having the secondary substances they have today. Now, looking back at the previous part, what do you think secondary substances might be? Could I draw a connection between the first paragraph and the second one? And if I'm sitting there going, nope, then I can go to the third paragraph and say, for hundreds of millions of years, there's been an evolutionary competition for advantage between plants and plant-eating insects. Okay, now they're talking about evolution, how plants and insects kind of are connected, right? Now, this certainly connects back to the second paragraph. The second paragraph says, insects have played a major role in plants having what they have. And 3 is saying there's been an evolutionary competition. So you don't have to be, an evolutionary biologist to kind of say, well, what's the connection there? What would competition with insects have to do with plants having the substances in them that they do? Anyone take a stab at that? Okay, so yeah, maybe the substances protect the plants from predators, right? Maybe the substances are some kind of thing that keeps the predator away, because they say competition, not just cooperation, right? So the insects are trying to eat the plants are presumably trying not to get eaten. So based on what the insects do, the plants respond, and it's kind of back and forth kind of thing in some way, whatever that means for the plants to respond. They don't have a brain or whatever, but they're somehow developing substances because of what insects do. And then that hopefully is going to connect somewhere back to the smell and taste. So maybe I could say, oh, so if I like the taste of carrots, maybe I should thank a bug at some point, because maybe the taste of carrots has to do with the interaction with bugs over time, right? Okay, something like that. So obviously I'm missing a lot of the details, and this may make you very uncomfortable. And I certainly wouldn't want to say, hey, you're now set to answer all the questions. Definitely not. But we can now go into a general question and get rid of some unlikely answer choices. So this one is asking us what the main point, and notice it's very detailed. And it's going to talk about stuff that we haven't read. But notice if we just look at the general scope of things, they're talking about the chemical composition of plants, they're talking about the role of insects, they're talking about competition with insects. Let's start, instead of just having you do the problem, I want you to scan for a bad answer. So pick one answer you don't like. Pick one answer you think we can cross out, and let's see if we can figure out why it's not good. Okay, D. All right. A couple of you are saying D. So what stands out about D? Two of you in a row just said D, no good. I'll agree with you, D's out. Let's cut it. So what's wrong with it? Yeah, it's super narrow. It's saying, it's talking about the right kind of stuff, evolutionary pressure, insects, secondary substances, all that's from the passage clearly. And that's what they usually do. They're going to kind of do a word salad of like just stuff that was mentioned in the passage. And now they suddenly say they have become numerous and diverse, but tend to be similar among closely related species. I don't know that this is wrong. I haven't read enough to know if this is right, but it can't be the main point because it doesn't fit in with this idea of this that there's been a sort of a competition between the two that's led to plants having the particular traits they have. It may be true that they have similar ones, but it seems like they're saying much more than that, right? Okay, what else can we cross off? If we know that there is this kind of evolutionary tug of war between plants and insects, we can get rid of some there. Yeah, Melina, you said A is out. What's wrong with A? So D was really narrow, and often scope will be the issue. Um, it's quite possible that these substances are protective. In fact, that's one of the things we speculated, that maybe these substances have evolved to protect the plants against insects. So that seems very likely to be true. But there's nothing about evolution. Yeah, we now the problem with saying it's wrong because we don't know about the biological process is it might be in there, right? And I try not to cross things out just because saying, hey, it wasn't there if I don't know for sure. Obviously, in real life, I'll usually have read all the passage, although you might try this without, try doing it without. But even when I've read it, I might not remember every single detail that was there. But I can say, hey, I know that even if it's there, it's too narrow. Where's the evolutionary part? Right? Where are the insects, right? They mentioned destruction of insects, but where's the competition with insects, right? Um, so I can at least see B mentions long-term competition between plants and insects. C mentions an evolutionary process of interaction between plants and insects. Now, E is interesting. E says, because plant mutations have led to the development of secondary substances. I don't know much about these secondary substances. Maybe that's what we're talking about. Plants have come to participate in a continuing process of competition. That's kind of weird. It sounds like because they have these substances, because we've had this development of these substances, plants have competed. That just seems weird, doesn't it? Why would plants only, wouldn't plants always have to compete with insects if they wanted to survive, right? So the substances cause the competition? Is it like testosterone? It makes the plants aggressive and want to kill the insects or something like that. That seems unlikely. But if I really don't know what I'm talking about, I can still kind of say, so this might get us down to 2. Anyone have a reason to get rid of either B or C? C is very certain. It results in large part, right? Is B less certain? Is B more careful? I see in terms of the author attitude or opinion words, I see result in large part here. So they're just saying it is, and this says has led to. So it seems like they're making a pretty factual assertion each one. So we could also look at what kind of words they're emphasizing, right? So B says that long-term competition between plants and insects, that sounds good. They specifically mentioned that, has led to a narrowing of the range of secondary substances and a narrowing of the range of insect species. So there's narrower things, right? I don't know much about that. I didn't read that part, right? And then C says the substances, so the particular substances possessed by plants, and then the different tastes and smells result from the evolutionary process. Do I know anything about that? Do the substances that plants have come from an evolutionary process? They seem to have said that, right? Insects have played a role, and specifically when you get to paragraph 3, for hundreds of millions of years, there's been an evolutionary competition, right? And then more specifically, um, they say that the smell and taste of plants comes from their chemicals, and if the chemicals come from evolution, then this has to be true. Now, that doesn't mean that C has to be the main point, right? Maybe B is a better take on it, but at least we know it's true, and it seems to fit all 3 of the paragraphs openers. It is in fact the answer. The narrowing thing, they talk about narrowing, although not quite this way. But so it's there and we could find it. But in some ways, we might be more likely to pick B if we had read more and actually be wrong. And I've seen that numerous times. One time I sat down with a student and said, okay, don't even look at the passage. This is a weird exercise, but you can try it. It's kind of a fun exercise. I said, don't even read the passage. Don't look at it all. Don't even read a word of the passage. Go straight to the questions and look for answers that don't seem likely, extreme answers, answers that seem like they'd be really hard to support, answers that are more careful and maybe are more likely to get answers. And in some cases, the student did better not having read it than having read it at all. Which sounds really crazy, but the idea is that sometimes we get distracted by what we read and say, wait, but was that the point? Yes, it was mentioned, but was it the point? And so here, even if a narrowing of the range is the point, it seems like they were talking about how this whole idea of this process over millions of years, there's been this evolution, not just that things have narrowed down, but that's where these things come from in the first place. So B is not a great answer and C is much better. I'm not just saying that because I've read the whole passage, but because it fits the content we have right here. Now, how do we verify that? By reading the whole passage. And the LSAT is not expecting you to wing it that much if you don't have to. They want you to be able to support it. But just because you could support it by going back through and spending more time doesn't mean you always will or can be able to do that, right? We won't necessarily have the time, the know-how, the comfort level, whatever it is to do that. So sometimes we do have to kind of narrow it down and get a good sense. Now, when you're reading, you can adjust. You might try doing a few passages where you read just one sentence, or some people do, especially in a longer passage, or longer paragraphs like this, they might read the first and last sentence of each paragraph, so they're reading 6. Whereas if it were a larger number of paragraphs, so maybe 5 or 6 short paragraphs, they might just read the beginning of each one. So then if I go back, I can see a little bit more, right? Okay, let's see. It is these secondary this would have been really helpful. Look at this last sentence. It is these secondary substances that give the plants their distinctive taste and smells. So now we can say, oh, specifically, what chemical composition are we talking about? Oh, we're talking about secondary substances, whatever that means. I don't care what it means right now. It just, okay, that's what a secondary substance is. It's a thing that makes broccoli taste like broccoli, right? And then I can back up here and I can say, still other secondary substances are not in themselves harmful, but are characteristic smells or tastes that dissuade the insect from feeding by warning it of the presence of some other substance that is harmful. It's like a bitter flavor that makes you know there's poison in there or something, right? So notice this contains a lot of information even without our having read the rest. It tells us that some of the substances are harmful, so that's the fighting off. And some other substances are protective in other ways. So it gets the idea of like, oh yeah, they're using this to protect themselves. Okay, now why would I read this sentence and not others? Well, because I'm in a hurry and I'm kind of trying to pass over things. Or sometimes what happens is I kind of wake up in the middle of a paragraph and I go, wait, I think I missed some things. Can I get my bearings without starting over? If I'm very early in the passage, I may actually start over. I may say, wait, oh, I kind of spaced on that first paragraph. Let me read it again. Because I think the first paragraph is the most important one. And if there's one paragraph you're going to read really thoroughly and completely, that would be the one to do it on for sure. But as I go on, I might be able to do this to pick up just enough detail to get there. If I do the same thing with paragraph 3, this is a very long sentence at the end of paragraph 3, but it says, as the competition has progressed, fewer and fewer plants have remained as suitable food sources for any one species of insect. Species of insects have thus tended to become associated with narrowly defined and often botanically restricted groups of plants. That sounds a lot like what B says about narrowing the range, right? But notice that part of it is said, it sounds like insects will narrow down what plants they eat, right? But B says something slightly different, which is that the plants will narrow down the substances they have and will therefore not have as many different insects eating them. And we don't actually have that statement. So even though B looks a lot like what it says at the end of paragraph 3, we can cross off B first because even if it were true, it's not the main point. And second, because it doesn't actually match what they said. But notice that now we have to do that, whereas before we might have just said, no, I don't think that's the point. That's too narrow. Okay, so that's the kind of thing we might do. Now, backing up a little bit more, we might say, well, no, I really want to read the whole first paragraph. So let's do that. Take a moment to read the entire first paragraph, and then we'll talk. Okay, so what does this add to our understanding? To some extent, not much, right? We could say, all right, we already saw that there were secondary substances, and we saw the secondary substances from paragraph 2 are maybe toxins or things that warn off insects and things like that. So now they're spelling that out more clearly. If we hadn't guessed it, that there's primary and secondary substances. Primary makes sense if they're secondary. The primary substances, they list what those are: proteins, carbohydrates, vitamins, hormones. Don't get too distracted by that. You probably know a lot of those words, right? But okay, the point is that they're things that the plant needs, and they're found in all plants. The secondary substances, diverse and multitudinous. Now, let's say you didn't know those words, right? A lot of times you could probably go through and cut out all the adjectives. They're a blah, 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 blah array of chemicals. Okay, so they're chemicals is what they're saying. I don't care that they're diverse and multitudinous. It means there's a lot of different ones, right? They have no known role in the internal chemical processes. And there's only a few of them in any one species, right? And now here they get to that same or similar ones, which sounds like what they said in D, but way too narrow, right? So they're basically saying, hey, there's all these different substances that plants don't need to survive, and it's these, it's the special broccoli substances that make broccoli taste like broccoli, and the special parsnip substances that make a parsnip taste like parsnip. Okay, and then we can now connect that and say, where do these come from? Oh, it's from bugs trying to eat them. So one kind of bug was trying to eat broccoli, so it tastes this way, and maybe another kind of bug was trying to eat parsnip, so it tastes that way, something like that. Okay, but that supports C more, right? The particular substances that you have And so the way they taste results from evolutionary process. So we can say a final answer and get out of there. So do you see how we might actually get pretty comfortable with the point without getting too deep into the question itself? Right, sorry, into the passage itself. We don't have to understand all the details. We don't have to process all the information to have a pretty good sense of the overall. Now, obviously, when we go to more specific questions, we will have to change tack. There are cases where we're going to ask about something very specific, and then we can't fake it. Okay. So let's think about two different questions they might ask. One of them asks, if you look at the bottom here, which one of the following is mentioned in the passage as a way in which insects can adapt when a plant develops defenses against them? And the other says, in the passage, the author discusses primary substances mainly in order to. Okay. Well, number 10, I've already seen them mention primary substances. And I can use my passage map that I'm developing to say, I bet it's not going to be anywhere but paragraph 1, because in paragraph 1, they talk about the primary substances. And I know I've taken them, if you want, frantically reading this, you don't need to right now. I've seen in paragraph 1 that they mention primary and secondary, and they start talking all about secondary. And then the paragraph 2 starts by mentioning secondary substances, right? So they're probably going to, since they say, why do they discuss them at all? It's probably the one time. And so we know where to look. Right? That's lines 4, starts in line 4 or 5. Okay. And it's an in order to, so we want to know why, right? Why did they mention them? Whereas 9 is saying, which of the following is mentioned in the passage as a way in which insects can adapt when a plant develops defense against them? So this is just which is mentioned. They're just asking us to find it. Just look it up. So we just need to find these. If we could kind of control F, we would, right? We just need to find where in the passage they mention insect response, insect adaptation. So we're looking for that. So can anyone find that part of the passage? Where should I look? Notice that this would be easier if you'd already read the whole passage, but it's not impossible to do not having read it, because we kind of look, where's a likely place? Have I already seen this? And then where in the passage is it going to show up? Can anyone find a line number or a section where they might talk about insect adaptations to defensive plants? Talia, are you talking about paragraph 2, line 2? What do you see? Okay, so what do you see in paragraph 2? So certain secondary substances can dissuade insects from feeding. So they've told us that there's some things that keep, we saw that down here, right? There are ones that can dissuade the insect from feeding. But what we want to know then is, okay, hold on, so that's cool, but we want to know, how can the insects adapt when that happens? So, okay, so now what can the bugs do? Do we see something about that? We've just got to this part, so that suggests that maybe we need to go farther. Yeah, I think that's 3, Chris. Yeah, paragraph 3. If we go to line 45, they're saying, look, if insects are to survive, they have to adapt, right? They must switch to other foods or evolve ways to circumvent the plant's defenses. They may evolve a way to detoxify a harmful substance, to store it in their bodies out of harmful way, or to avoid its effects in some other manner. Yeah, so we have an answer to this first one, and it's something like, they can switch to other foods, or get around the defenses. We're just finding that part, and we're literally just saying, hey, which of these fits what they said? That's it. Now, 10 is more interpretive. Why do they mention primary substances? So if we look back to that part, it says in lines 4 and 5, there's two kinds of substances, primary and secondary. The primary are proteins, carbohydrates, things that are found in all plants. And then they go on and on about the secondary. So why do they mention primary in the first place? What was the point of bringing them up if we're just going to go talk about something else? What's the point if I'm writing a story to say, you know, there's some stories that, you know, make you feel good inside about the human condition and warm your heart and make you want to live another day? Sorry, this isn't that kind of story, right? Like, why would I do that? Why would I bring something up and then talk about something totally else? And if you notice when you read on, they never mention the primary substances much after this, right? Secondary substances here. They have to, you have things that increase their likelihood of survival. Some signal this, right? So the secondary vary. Okay, so the primary are the foundation and don't change. And so that's very technical, Melina. And it seems right, although we don't know for sure they don't change, right? We know they're everywhere, so they must not change that much, right? Maybe if you change those, the plant just dies, right? But we don't even need to get that technical because we can say, well, but why do they bring them up in the first place, right? They're bringing primary up just to tell you what secondary are, right? Just to introduce. So they're making a contrast with what they really want to tell us about, right? Which is secondary substances, right? So imagine I could be talking about anything. I could say, uh, most dogs' primary sense is smell, and they find their way through the world by sniffing, and they tell what food they like by smelling it. But this dog doesn't have a sense of smell, and it does things differently. Oh, okay, it's giving this new idea, right? So here they're saying, here there's these primary substances. That's not their main story. We're going to talk about the secondary ones. So the first answer has to say something like either switch or get around, and the second one has to say something like to switch to contrast with the secondary substances. Okay, so let's try it with the answers. You want to try both of these. Okay, what kind of answer did we get for number 9? Make sure you're pulling your answer directly from the passage somewhere. So whatever you choose, it has to be in there. Yeah. So we had two options. We had switch to other foods or get around the defenses. And they talked about specific ways to do that. So notice they didn't say watch out for distinctive leaf or flower structures or have more babies. We're dying, but we keep making more of us, right? They didn't talk about whether they're pollinating. They're talking about what they're eating, right? Um, a lot of you went for E, be careful, right? They didn't just say stay away from the dangerous parts. They said either switch to something else or get around the defenses, right? And that's not just the dangerous part, especially if we're talking about substances, right? They specifically said that they can switch to other foods. And so this is like the less interesting of the two. It's the less technical, but that's really interesting because we didn't have to know any science to say, oh yeah, switch to other foods and eat something else are the same thing. That's got to be true, right? They said it. And so we don't have to, have our master's degree in chemistry to connect those pieces, right? Does that mean that some of these others might not throw us off? They sure might. They sure might. But the more confident I am that I've got a match, the less I have to worry about those others. Now, what about 10? Which of these matches are prediction that they brought up primary suspects, substances as a contrast to set up what the secondary substances were? Yeah, to help explain what secondary substances are. We can understand secondary better by knowing primary. That's what they set up here. Here's what the primary are. Primary means you need them to survive. Every plant has them. Secondary are these weird, extra things that might do different things, and they make them taste and smell a certain way, but they're not essential to plant life, right? Whereas, are they trying to tell us about how plants grow and metabolize? There's no how. They do, but we don't know how they do it. Are they talking about insects at this point? That's true, but they're not talking about it at that point in the passage. It's too early. The great diversity of chemicals, that's not specific enough. Sure, there's a ton of chemicals, but the diversity is in the secondary substances, not in the primary anyway. Plants adaptation to insects, no, not for the primary. All the plants have the same one, so that doesn't fit. Okay, good. So then when all else fails, I'm going to give you the real speed round. When all else fails, go with the tendencies of good answers. So I'm going to ask you to look at number 11, and I want you to pick an answer in 12 seconds. And the reason I'm going to have you pick it in 12 seconds is I want you to look at what the sentences begin with and see what's less likely and what's more likely. You don't have to be right. I'm only going to give you 12 seconds, but I want you to look at the answer choices and play your tendencies. Some chemicals, most plants that evolve, most insects that feed, many secondary substances, some toxic substances. Here we go. 12 seconds, pick an answer. All right, give me your best shot. Totally unfair and unreasonable of me, but do it anyway. If I have to do something that fast, what are my least likely candidates? What are my least likely candidates of these and why? Most, yeah, most is no good because don't get me wrong. It's not that the most couldn't be supported, right? They certainly could say most plants did this. They could easily say that. But if I have to guess, the most is going to be harder to support than a some or a many. Even many is pretty vague. Many can just be like, if I say I have many friends, well, what does that mean? Does that mean I have like 12 friends, or does that mean I have 700 friends or 1,000,000 friends? You don't really know what many means in that context. So many is a little more open-ended, but some is the better choice. And so we want something like A or E. And the beautiful thing is if I were in a hurry, but maybe I had more than 12 seconds, I could say, hey, A and E are the most likely. So if I'm stressed out and like don't have enough time to spend on this passage, maybe I'll look at A and E first. Just like on a logic game, I might say, I don't think that B can be true. So let me look at one of the ones I think can be true. And test those. Test the ones that are most likely. So if I look at A, some chemicals that are not known to be directly involved in the growth or metabolism of any species of plant play vital roles in the lives of various kind of plants. Let's see. If we look at the chemicals that we've been talking about, the secondary substances, are they involved in the growth or metabolism? In other words, these secondary substances that give plants their distinctive tastes and scents, are they involved in how the plant grows? Right? They said the primary substances did that. That's what we just got to. So they are not known to be directly involved, right? So that fits a secondary substance. Do they play vital roles in the lives of various kind of plants? Well, look, they've talked all about how, and I know I didn't even let you read all of this passage, right? But looking at a bit of paragraph 2 the way we did, and a little bit of paragraph 3 the way we did, we saw that these substances were protecting the plants from insects. That sounds pretty important. And so I'm not saying that you should have definitively known the answer was A in 12 seconds or even now. It is the right answer. And later on, if you have access to Prep Test 68, you can check out the rest of this passage and try it at your leisure. Again, it's Prep Test 68, passage 2, in the lower left, right lower corner. But what I'm getting at is that we can know some tendencies that can help us survive these passages a little better. The first time I took the LSAT, I got in a little bit of trouble with reading comp. And I was a little cocky. Reading comp is one of my favorite parts. I felt very comfortable with it. I had never had any timing trouble at home. And on the test, I don't know if I was just being more careful or more thorough. And sometimes people they try to get more meticulous on test day than they've been at home. So maybe I was doing that. But I suddenly looked at my watch and went, oh, I could run out of time. Like, I'm in trouble. And I had to pick up the pace. And I had to pick up the pace to an uncomfortable extent. And it worked out. I survived. I did well on the LSAT, but it was only because I had practiced enough that even when I picked up the pace, I could be pretty confident in the tendencies of the answers, and I could be pretty confident in my ability to go back and find the pieces. It's not easy to do that. And so it works to make yourself uncomfortable, to try reading just part of the passage, to try answering questions with incomplete knowledge, not because you're going to be right every time, but because the more you can have a sense of what you're looking for, the more likely you are to catch it. I think about how we do with numbers. If you're doing math, you might, if you're doing a bunch of algebra, you might say, well, the answer should be around 120. So if I get something really different, I kind of know I'm off. You buy something at the store and they tell you the price and you go, no, that just didn't sound right. And that allows you to catch when there's a mistake. If you look at your bank balance and it's way lower than it should be, wait, has someone been defrauding you? Did you get double charged by somebody? It allows you to catch number problems. So the same thing can happen with conceptual things, right? Even though reading comp feels more like squishy than, say, math, in some ways it's very much the same. There is support for this material, and the more comfortable you get with cutting through some of the complexity and just focusing on what's the basic story, and where in the passage are they talking about the thing they're asking about? What exactly can it support? It can feel very, very logical and predictable, which is kind of what you want. You don't want to feel like it's a game where oh, well, they say it's B, oh, well. All right, want to be able to feel like we can prove it. So I would recommend that you go back and try the rest of this passage if you have access to it, Prep Test 68, passage 2 in the first section of reading comp, and see what you think. I will stop there with the passage, but I'd love to hear any questions that you all have. And again, if you want to try any of our classes, if you haven't already, would love to have you. All right, folks. Well, thanks very much. Hope you found it helpful. If you're watching at home, enjoy, and good luck to everyone on the test.